From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section here in the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's program with Dr. Ann Kirschner, Dean Macaulay Honors College, City University of New York, who will be talking about her newest book, Lady at the OK Corral, The True Story of Josephine Marcus Earp. Since March is Women's History Month, the subject is especially fitting. Ann Kirschner has had such a varied career: writer, media and marketing pioneer in television, cable and satellite, academic and administration, that I'll just give you some of the highlights of her accomplishments. In addition to bachelor's and master's degrees, Ann has a PhD in English literature from Princeton University, where she began her academic career as a lecturer in Victorian literature. She's been a freelance writer and editor at CBS, the New York Times, and a publishing house. She's held administrative positions at the Modern Language Association and the New York Public Library. In the area of media, she's headed up several startup services, including the National Football League Sunday Ticket and NFL.com. And I've got someone here you've got to talk to who's writing a book at the library called Football Nation. NFL.com, the first sports league on satellite TV. Ann has served in executive positions for communications, consulting firms, and sales and marketing companies. She has and continues to serve as a board member for such diverse and prestigious organizations as the Jewish Women's Archive, Open University of Israel, and Soros Foundation. Ann's first book is Salah's Gift, My Mother's Holocaust Story. It's based on her mother's experiences over 5 years in Nazi slave labor camps, the diary she kept, and more than 350 letters she saved. The story of Josephine Marcus Earp goes into an entirely different direction, and we'll soon learn more about this Jewish woman and Wyatt Earp. And following the presentation, there will be a book sale and signing. Let me remind you that this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period. But please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you're consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. A warm welcome to Dr. Ann Kirschner.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. It strikes me just from the outset how different the recording of history and events is today as opposed to the era that we're going to talk about, because one of the things that I found so striking about the Earps and the telling of their tale is how hidden things could be in those days as opposed to these days when it seems like so little is hidden. So let's see if I can figure out our mouse. Ah, there we go. Nope, don't look at that picture yet. Did you know that Wyatt Earp was buried in a Jewish cemetery? I didn't. And that was the question that really set me off on this quest. It seemed so odd to me. I had grown up with Wyatt Earp, as many of us had, who grew up in the 50s. That's me as a baby, and that's my big brother, Joey, getting ready to watch black and white television. And in the 1950s, Wyatt Earp was everywhere on television. Every single American network had a Wyatt Earp or Tombstone themed show on. Anybody remember Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Gunsmoke? Yeah, some of you remember. How many of you could still sing the theme song? Which, since we're being webcast, I am not going to sing. Okay, we've got a couple of takers here. So what really struck me was the untold story of Tombstone. There were women in Tombstone. Many of the early chronicles of the West made it seem as if there were no mothers, daughters, sisters, lovers, only men in Tombstone. And so when we were watching television and watching Wyatt Earp, we certainly never thought about Wyatt Earp having a Jewish wife. And we thought we knew something about the gunfight. We thought it was the good guys against the bad guys. What we didn't know was that there was this gutsy, busty broad who had a lover on both sides of the gunfight at the OK Corral. And we thought we knew something about Wyatt Earp himself. He was the one with the white hat, right? But what we didn't know was that the Wyatt Earp that we knew was in large part a story of Josephine Earp's making. She had the extraordinary sense of celebrity that in some ways shaped the legend of Wyatt Earp into what she would call a nice, clean story. So let me take you back to Josephine's beginnings. And in later life, Josephine would always say that she was the daughter of a wealthy German merchant. Not true. In fact, most of what Josephine told us about herself was not true. So this is a map of the German Empire, 1871, and the section that's circled in red, Posen, is where the Marcus family was from. This is Josephine's father's family, but her mother was from that region as well. And actually, in case you think I have wandered totally from my mother's story, if you look just south of Posen, you come to Silesia, which is the region of now Poland that my mother was from. But that is the only thing that my mother and Josephine Marcus Earp have in common. So the Marcus family came from the Posen region around 1850. And they came first to New York. Josephine was born in 1860. And the family was struggling. He was a baker, her father, and they were reading in the many Jewish newspapers in New York at the time about the wonders of San Francisco, and you could make your fortune in San Francisco, and they really were not making their fortune in New York, so they decided to emigrate again. And off they go to San Francisco via the Isthmus of Panama. This is one of the steamers that served San Francisco in that era. That's how you got there, through the Isthmus and then up to San Francisco. But the San Francisco that they arrived in was a thriving Jewish community and a highly stratified Jewish community. The most successful San Franciscan Jews were German Jews, and then there were the other Jews, and the Polish Jews, and that would be Josephine's family. They were definitely on the wrong side of the tracks, and this prejudice goes back to those early days of the German Empire, when it was the German Jews who were better educated, more affluent, more secular. The Polish Jews spoke Yiddish rather than German. They tended to be peddlers and much more religious than the German Jews. And that was the stratification that existed in San Francisco as well. And so Josephine found herself once again in a community that was highly stratified, and there was nothing second class about Josephine. She was an extremely pretty, active, outgoing young woman, and she felt she had the world to conquer. The spark for what would change Josephine's life came from an unexpected source, and that was the HMS Pinafore craze, which swept America in this time. Every town had a Pinafore troop, and the Arizona Territory, which was just out there to the east of California, had several touring companies, and they were so desperate for performers that they would go into the amateur dancing academies and attract young singers and dancers to join the troupe. So Josephine gets recruited to go to the Arizona Territory, and this strikes her as a terrific idea. She's going to run away from home. She's going to become an actress. And that woman there sort of lolling on the couch, that's Pauline Markham, whose troupe was one of the best-known ones in the Arizona Territory. So Josephine goes off to what is not yet the state of Arizona, but the territory. Oops, let's just cover her up. We don't actually know exactly what Josephine looked like. As a young girl, we do know that she was very attractive. And I'll show you a little bit later from a slide from one of the forensic experts I worked with to try and authenticate some of the pictures of young Josephine. But we do know that she caused quite a sensation when she showed up in Tombstone. These are some of the age progression photographs that I think are pretty close to accurate. All the ones on the bottom are the ones that we know really are Josephine. The ones on the top are ones that have been theorized and authenticated as far as we can by my expert. So there's Wyatt Earp in the middle of this slide. And Wyatt was about 6 foot tall. He and his brothers looked so much alike that sometimes people mistook them for each other, but they all shared this incredible height and leanness and handsomeness. Now, the two people on the bottom of the page on either side of Wyatt, those were the secrets that Josephine most did not want you to know about. The fellow on the right is Johnny Bean, who was the first sheriff of Cochise County. And the woman on the left is Mattie Blaylock, who was Wyatt's common-law wife when he first came to Tombstone. And everything that I will tell you about Josephine's deep interest, some might say obsession, in keeping the truth of what happened in Tombstone from you has really nothing to do with the gunfight itself and everything to do with Johnny Bean and Mattie Blaylock. The gunfight actually did not take place in the OK Corral. This is real inside baseball stuff, but if any of you are Earp experts, and I meet them everywhere I go, you will jump up at the end of this presentation and say, but you didn't tell them that the gunfight actually didn't happen at the OK Corral. It's true, it didn't. It happened next to the OK Corral on Fremont Street. And it was, in fact, the lawmen against the cowboys. But there's a tremendous amount of ambiguity about the right and wrong of this situation, and historians have spent their entire lives trying to figure out what happened in those 30 seconds. What we do know is that they changed Wyatt's life forever because he was forever associated with that gunfight, and it certainly changed Josephine's life forever. At the end of the gunfight, Wyatt Earp was the only man who escaped without any gunshots whatsoever. 3 people were killed. And Wyatt then embarked on what became known as the Vendetta Ride to find the people who killed one brother and maimed another. When the gunfight was over and Wyatt was cleared of any wrongdoing, he and Josephine, whom I believe met first in Tombstone. You know, I haven't actually told you that story yet. Let's go back 2 minutes. When Josephine first came to Tombstone, she came as the common-law wife of Johnny Bean. She had chosen very badly. Johnny was a dirty dog. He was a womanizer. And she soon left him. And in the intervening months, she met Wyatt Earp, who had a wife. He left his wife, and he and Josephine had an affair. The gunfight, one part was allied with Johnny Bean, and one part was allied with Wyatt Earp. But the feud that had been ignited just before the gunfight really never ended. And Wyatt had work to do, and so Josephine left Tombstone. She had already left Johnny Bean. Now she left Wyatt as well, went back home to wait for Wyatt. While Wyatt took his wife put her on a train, and sent his common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock, back to his mother and father. I think that was probably the most cowardly act Wyatt Earp ever did, was to send poor Mattie Blaylock back to his mother to wait for Wyatt. But he did, and it took quite a while before she figured out that he was not coming to get her. Their adventures from there on in, Wyatt Earp picks up Josephine in 1882, and for the next 47 years, they are together. They had adventures in every boomtown that you've heard of, and probably quite a few boomtowns that you haven't heard of. I went to visit many of them. Probably the one where I had the best time, and where I think actually Josephine and Wyatt had the best time, was Nome, Alaska. Just to give you a sense of where Nome is, it is almost as far north of Seattle as Seattle is west of New York. It is right under the Arctic Circle. When they got together, Josephine and Wyatt, in 1882, they didn't have any money, and for the next 47 years, that's really what they did, was make money, lose money, make money, lose money. They never seemed to care about money for the sake of it, but it was adventure that drove them. Josephine, her love of adventure, which I think is what first led to that running away to the Pinafore troop, really never left her. Nome, Alaska in 1900 was one of the most exciting places on Earth. I mean, today it's a sleepy little town, quite desolate, but you could go out to the public beach in Nome, Alaska, and there I am on the shore of the Bering Sea, and with a little pan, just go out to the sand, as you would, on any beach now, only gold would emerge. So instead of having to have incredible equipment to dig down into the earth, gold was found on the shores of Nome, Alaska. And the reason that I say Josephine was so happy there was because in Alaska, for the first time, she was in a community where the stratification that she had experienced in San Francisco between the German and the Polish Jews, and in Tombstone and in the other boom towns, where to be a saloon keeper's common-law wife, which is what Josephine was, always made her feel as if she wasn't quite the respectable woman she wanted to be. And that title, Lady at the OK Corral, is in part ironic because Josephine did have those two sides to her. Part of her wanted to be gung-ho for adventure, always, and the other part of her wanted to be a respectable lady like her sister, her younger sister, who became a very successful businesswoman and society lady in San Francisco. So they roamed around, and as they aged, they spent most of their time in a circle between Los Angeles, the desert between LA and between Arizona and California, and San Francisco, Oakland, where Josephine's family lived, and she was very close to that one sister in particular. I've actually been to the site where this picture was taken. Josephine, in addition to having this deep conflict about whether she wanted to be an adventuress or a lady, the other conflict in her was, did she love luxury or did she love the desert? You know, she loved to stay in fancy hotels with beautiful sheets and fancy clothes, but she also loved living out in the desert. And believe me, you don't get any more isolated than this particular spot, which is outside of what's now called Earp, California. In 1929, the era of Tombstone and the OK Corral, which had already been famous throughout their lifetime, got a new shot in the arm. First of all, by the town of Tombstone itself, which launched what it called Eldorado Days, but much more importantly and lastingly, by the creation of Hollywood and the first films, so many of which had cowboys, Indians, Western themes. And two of the most popular stars were William S. Hart and Tom Mix, who became very, very close to Wyatt and Josephine. That's William S. Hart on the horse. So the story of Tombstone and the OK Corral was being told, but Josephine didn't like how it was being told. You know, first of all, she was nervous that somebody would find out about her as Mrs. Bean or the sad story of Mattie Blaylock. But more importantly, she wanted the image of Wyatt to be heroic and scrubbed clean like a Sunday school teacher, as somebody said later on. What made her so nervous about Mattie was not simply that Wyatt had had a common-law wife before, but after Mattie figured out that Wyatt was not coming back for her, she didn't have too many options. You know, women at that time, particularly women who were not at all educated, it wasn't as if she could go and get a job someplace. She became a drug addict, she was a prostitute, and she committed suicide, and on the day before she died, she was cursing Wyatt Earp as the man who done her wrong. So this was the story that Josephine was most terrified about. When an enterprising writer named Stuart Lake approached the Earps to tell the story the way Wyatt and Josephine wanted it told, they thought that was a really dandy idea. And Wyatt began to sit for interviews with Stuart Lake, Josephine there almost all the time, making sure that she caught every word. And so it was Stuart Lake who published the first biography of Wyatt Earp, and it was an immediate bestseller. America, particularly in the era of the Depression, was ready for a hero. To the end of his days, Wyatt was this good-looking, aristocratic guy, while Josephine, well, ladies, that's not really fair, but she didn't quite keep her looks the way Wyatt did. I kind of think she looks like Sophie Tucker in some of her later pictures. And when Wyatt died in 1929, it was a national news story. This is the photograph, the telegram that Josephine sends to Stuart Lake, telling him that Wyatt has died and asking him to come to the funeral. And these are the pallbearers who were there at the funeral, including Wilson Meisner and William S. Hart and Tom Mix. And the newspapers seized on it as the passing of the Old West. Josephine didn't even attend the funeral. She was too distraught. And it took years before she was seen again in the public eye. But one of the things that really brought her out of hiding and into a new era of her life was a letter from Lincoln Ellsworth, the Arctic explorer, who had read Stuart Lake's book, thought that Wyatt Earp was the epitome of American individualism and heroism, and decided that he would name his boat the Wyatt Earp when he went back to the South Pole. And he wrote to Josephine, and Josephine, with that modern sense of celebrity that I think is very special to her, immediately realized this was a really great thing. This was, in our parlance, this would be like naming the moon landing, you know, the shuttle or something after Wyatt Earp. So she sends Lincoln Ellsworth Wyatt's last eyeglasses and one of his shotguns, and Lincoln Ellsworth creates a little shrine on the boat. And it's hard to imagine today, but Lincoln Ellsworth's name and the Wyatt Earp, the name of his ship, was in the New York Times every month for about 6 years. And when Lincoln Ellsworth was lost at sea, it was a front page story, and when he was recovered, it was, you know, continued to be a front page story. And this is the New York Times on January, I think it's the 22nd, 1936. Edward VII proclaimed, you know, new leader of Britain, and there, over on the left-hand side of the page, is Lincoln Ellsworth. So this was as great a polishing up of Wyatt Earp's reputation as you could possibly have. This was my attempt to show you what that actually said. But take it from me, the byline is, "Aboard the motor ship Wyatt Earp." So perhaps the good feeling about Lincoln Ellsworth was what emboldened Josephine to think, nah, now it's time to tell my story. And she met some distant cousins of Wyatt's, two women, Venolia Earp Ackerman and Mabel Earp Kaysen. and began to talk to them about writing her memoirs. And they worked together on it for several years, and during these years, Josephine lived mostly with their family. You can see she's sort of slimmed down here and looks a little like an Italian widow. They even went back to Tombstone. Here's a picture of Josephine. This is on the way back from Tombstone. So imagine, it's her first trip back since 1882. You know, we think America has changed in the last, 10 or 20 years, but the era that Josephine lived through with Wyatt was a time of unbelievable change for America. You know, going from stagecoaches and horses to planes, trains, and automobiles, going from an era when a man like Wyatt could make his money as a saloon keeper and a gambler. Now you're in an era of prohibition, and gambling is illegal. So the changes in America were unbelievably powerful. But Josephine was, the closer that Venolia and Mabel came to the real story of Tombstone, and they were fine writers and researchers, the more nervous Josephine became that even now, and now it's in the late 1930s, even now she hears those hoofbeats from Tombstone coming closer, and what if they out her as Mrs. Bean, or what if they tell the terrible tale of the demise of Mattie Blaylock? So she loses her nerve, and she forces them to stop writing the memoir. She has them burn the manuscript. She watches them burn the manuscript. She puts a hex on anybody who will tell her story, which is usually the part where people in the audience begin moving away from me. As far as she's concerned, that's the end. Her story will never be told. And she doesn't see too much of the Caissons after that. And she probably is in the early stages of dementia. She is more and more paranoid. She has very, very little to live on. She walks around with a big purse filled with clippings. Interestingly, not clippings about Wyatt Earp, but clippings about her younger sister and her success in San Francisco society. She takes to stalking John Flood, who had been her very close friend and Wyatt's, and he writes all of this down. So this is his writing on the back of an old calendar. She comes to his house. She tries to put her hand through the screen door. "I'll get back at you good and hard." That's what Mrs. Earp wrote to him. But when she eventually dies, which is in 1944, it is not a national news story. It's a tiny little piece in the Los Angeles Times that the widow of Wyatt Earp has passed on. Nobody attended her funeral. She died penniless. Sid Grauman of Grauman's Theater and William S. Hart paid for her funeral. And interestingly, it was officiated over by a rabbi. Josephine's relationship to Judaism was very tenuous. She wasn't ashamed of it, but she also wasn't very engaged with Judaism in any way. And yet, at that darkest moment of her life, when Wyatt dies, she decides that she will bury him in the family plot in a Jewish cemetery in Colma, California. And then when she dies, she is buried right next to him, and there they are. It's the most visited grave in Colma. Given that it is my pleasure to be at the library today, I thought I would just tell you a few more minutes about how the story was put together. I didn't go to every place on this map, but I went to most of them, and spent a lot of time reading newspapers and doing interviews and trying to get as much of the primary source material as I could. I talked a little bit before about some of the photography. With the help of this forensic expert in New York, Carrie Lane, we did a lot of measurements, and now I know what a philtrum is. I'll share that with you. It's this little thing over here. Yeah, you all know that already. And that is how I ended up with this photograph as the one of Josephine on the cover of the book, in comparison to the pictures of older Josephine. I had access to more of Josephine's original letters than anyone ever has, and that was through the good graces of a private collector. And I worked with a couple of Macaulay Honors College students in putting those letters into a form that I could use them. Interestingly, and probably no surprise to any of you, 20-somethings don't know how to read cursive handwriting. So that was when you think about where this is all going, it's an interesting finding. So they were very helpful on this project, but reading cursive was not one of their strong suits. I worked in many, many different libraries, and this is a page from the original manuscript. They didn't burn all the copies. So one of the copies is in the Ford County Historical Society in Dodge City, and it was my great pleasure to spend 3 days in Dodge City reading that manuscript. And again, this is not something that the youngins are good at doing. I guess I'm really a library rat when it comes right down to it. When it comes to American stories, I think you kind of don't get much more American than the story of the Frontier West and Tombstone and the OK Corral. But to my mind, you can't tell that story until you put the women back in the picture. Josephine was denied her story in part because she didn't want it told, but for many women, and this is National Women's History Month, for many women it's simply because their stories have not been told. So I think the great joy for me was putting this woman back in the picture, and you don't get many more interesting and fun stories to tell than the story of Josephine at the OK Corral. So thank you very much for being so attentive, and I'd love to hear if any of you have some questions for me. The question was whether they had any children. No, alas, they did not. Josephine had 2 miscarriages, and as far as I can tell, she was unable to have children. They were very close to Wyatt's family, and she was very close to her nieces and nephew. And I did get to meet several of her descendants, so it was fun to have the direct link back to her. Did I ever find out exactly what she was doing on the day of the gunfight? I know what she says she was doing. What she says she was doing is she was at home, and after the gunfight, there was a loud alarm, a ringing of a bell that went up that could be heard throughout Tombstone, because there had been so much hostility and frightening things going on in the town, robberies, etc., in the months leading up to the gunfight, that the Tombstone Citizens Association had agreed that in case there was a town emergency, they would ring a bell. Josephine hears the bell, and according to what she writes in the memoir, she runs into town so fast that she didn't even put her bonnet on. She gets to the site where everybody is gathered around. She sees a tremendous amount of bloodshed, and there were already dead bodies being taken away, but she sees Wyatt standing unharmed, and so she goes back again. That's what she says that she did. And I have no reason to doubt it. In talking to some of the Earpists, or Earpies, as my husband calls them, you know, sometimes it is useful to have a woman's point of view, and many of the Earp historians have said to me, particularly one fellow in particular, that they can plot every day, practically down to the minute, of what Wyatt Earp was doing leading up to and at the gunfight. And they have assured me, these men, that Wyatt didn't have time to have an affair in Tombstone. That's a joke. Of course Wyatt had time to have an affair in Tombstone. It's sort of a funny thing to imagine that he and Josephine could not have found a quiet place and a quiet amount of time to conduct a fair. I do think that in the days immediately before the gunfight, Wyatt really was very busy.
Was she friendly at all, or were the Earp women friendly with her?
The question is what was her relationship with the Earp women. All of the Earps had common law wives. None of them knew Josephine in Tombstone. In fact, Virgil's wife, Allie, she didn't even think Josephine really was in Tombstone. So again, in Tombstone, the society was quite stratified, but the Earp wives kept entirely to themselves. You know, they made a little money sewing, and they never went into town, so there really would not have been too much opportunity for them to meet.
I know you did most of your research out west, but what resources did you find here in the library?
The newspapers online are an extraordinary resource. Thank you, library, whoever did that. Just to be able to scan the newspapers, and they're in a wonderfully searchable form, was fantastic for me. Chronicling America. It's a incredible historical resource. Any other questions?
How did they allow non-Jews to be buried in the Jewish cemetery?
The question was, how did they allow non-Jews to be buried in a Jewish cemetery? I asked the manager of the Hills of Eternity Cemetery exactly the same question, and he sort of shrugged and said, "This is California." Not only did they allow Wyatt Earp to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, but both Wyatt and Josephine were cremated. And, you know, so clearly they play by different rules.
As someone from California, I appreciate that answer. That makes sense. My question is, given the true story of Josephine Earp and the one that she perpetuated, as a storyteller, which one do you prefer?
Oh, I prefer the true story. And you know what? I don't think, if I were to make a novel out of this, you know, you probably would think that it's unbelievable. I think the true story is so incredibly interesting that it's the one that grabs my attention.
And why then would she be so reticent about the truth if it is a better story and she was so loving of the celebrity and the publicity?
So the story is, why did she prefer a whitewashed story to the real story? Because together with things like prohibition and gambling, common law marriage, which was entirely common in the frontier, was no longer so common in the 1930s and 1940s. I mean, the frontier was closed, and she didn't want to appear to be a woman of ill repute. And so part of it was the story of Johnny Bean, and that she had lived openly in Tombstone as Mrs. Bean. She received her mail as Mrs. Bean. So that is one part of it that she didn't want you to know. But the other part of it was, you know, that she and Wyatt could be blamed for the dark demise of Mattie Blaylock Earp, that she had committed suicide and had become, you know, a prostitute, not in that order, and that somehow it would be laid to the adultery between Wyatt and Josephine. So she didn't want to be the floozy of Tombstone. And the story of Mattie Blaylock did not come out until 1955. So Josephine managed to keep a lid on it all of those years, and only, you know, a decade later did it come out. Gary?
Did Wyatt or Josephine make any money residuals from any of the book stories, movies that were made of this story?
The question was, did they make any money from their story? The answer is yes. Josephine received half the royalties from Stuart Lake's book. Almost nothing from the films. And there was a lot of friction between her and Stuart Lake. And Stuart Lake, I think, was a very canny writer himself. And I bet if we could go back and audit those books, I think Josephine got cheated out of quite a lot. And then after Josephine's death, her relatives write to Stuart Lake because they've heard that there's a television show coming out. And they say, well, is there anything in this for us? And he says, oh, no, there's nothing. So I think Stuart cut a pretty sharp deal. And, you know, Josephine, the fact that she died in debt, you know, I think there was probably much more money to be shared, because I can promise you Stuart Lake did not die in debt. The one, yes, the one in the hat. That is Mattie Blaylock, and I'm not absolutely sure that that's a fly photograph, but yes, then that is. Thank you. I will henceforth identify that as a fly photograph. I think there's another one here also. That's a fly photograph. I did not know that. It is my good luck to have a historian in the house who's actually from, whose family is from Tombstone, and so to hear that is really fantastic. So this is not only a fly photograph, but when I'm asked about the interesting women in Tombstone, and I think about women like Clara Spaulding Brown, who was the correspondent for the San Diego Union, and she was writing continually about the gunfight and the feud with the Earps. Or think about Nellie Cashman, who was an entrepreneur. Now I can add Molly Fly, wife of Camillus Fly, and that she actually took a lot of the photographs. That's fabulous. Thank you. The question is, when did guns in holsters become common? It certainly was not common in Tombstone in 1881. They either put their guns just in their waist, or Wyatt had a coat that had a special pocket in it, but there were no holsters. So that and the quick draw, I think that those are more Hollywood inventions. Holsters? Well, I'm not sure when it went out of style, but holsters didn't come into style. They were not in style in the Frontier West as far as I know. I would certainly not put myself forth as a holster expert. But I do know that Wyatt was famous for keeping peace when he was a lawman in Dodge City by what was called buffaloing, which meant taking your gun and with the barrel of the gun, you know, hitting a bad guy against the head, which was kinder than shooting him. And none of that involved any holsters. It was just the gun in the pants. So, but I will do some research and find out the answer to that. One more question?
Did Josephine ever really perform in the Pinafore group?
The question was, did Josephine ever really perform in the Pinafore group? I believe she did. I believe she performed in Prescott and a couple of other towns. I believe she performed in Tombstone as well. This is an area of some controversy, again, amongst the Earpies. There's a whole school of thought that says Josephine was not a Pinafore performer, she was a prostitute, and that's why she came to the Arizona Territory. I've looked at this research every which way to Sunday, and I am convinced that she was a Pinafore dancer. When she was living with the Kaysen family in the 1930s, and there was a Pinafore performance that came to LA, the two younger Kaysens were going to see it, and before they left, Josephine got up and did the hornpipe dance for them, which she remembered doing from her days. So I'm sold, but I think the Pinafore, the picture of her as a Pinafore dancer, to me is one of the, you know, the more charming ways when I think of her as a young teenager. That's how I think of her.
There are no programs or newspaper announcements of that?
The question is, were there not any newspaper announcements or the equivalent of playbills? There are. Josephine had a bit part. So she was just part of a dancer in the chorus. So she would not have had a shout out, and she was also using an assumed name because she was afraid that her parents would find her and drag her back by the hair, which is in fact actually what happened the first time. So there's no definitive proof, but to me there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that adds up to that. Thank you again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.